Hello, senior high school students. So this is the second part of our discussion about the exposure and vulnerability. For the lesson 2, we have the vulnerability and risk. Do you have any idea what is vulnerability and risk? Vulnerability is the characteristic of a community as being susceptible or prone to hazard or disasters. Vulnerability is due to several characteristics or conditions. Some of the characteristics affecting vulnerability includes the physical, social, economic, and environmental factors. And also, vulnerability is not permanent. The risk factor may change depending on how the element cope with the changes in the environment for its own safety. For instance, nakatira kayo sa isang community, low-lying community yung mga laging binabaha. And then, lilipat kayo sa mataas na lugar. So, you will change your residency. So, it may reduce its vulnerability since lumipat kayo sa mataas na lugar. We also have 4 classifications of vulnerabilities, which are the physical, social, economic, and environmental vulnerability. Under the physical vulnerability, these classifications pertains to the physical aspect of the community, the people, and infrastructures. It may also pertain to the location of the community. For example, yung sinabi ko kanina, yung nakatira sa low-lying areas that are more vulnerable to flood. Pero yung mga nasa mountainous areas naman, they are more vulnerable to landslides. And also, in physical aspect of the people, it may pertain to demographic profile of the people living on a certain community. For instance, a community which composes of a diverse, ibig sabihin magkahalong may bata, may matanda, may mga sakit. So, kapag ganon, they are more vulnerable than other communities. And lastly, for physical vulnerability of infrastructure, it may pertain to the type of houses, building, compositions of bridges and buildings, and others. So next, the social vulnerability. Social vulnerability is the incapability of the community to survive the hostile effects of threats of disasters. Social vulnerability may be due to the principles and beliefs of the people in a certain locality that includes aspects related to your awareness of the people to disasters, the existence of emergency preparedness plan. Third one is the access to basic social services. Number 4, the customs and traditions. Then also, the leadership of government officials and yung optimism in life. Halimbawa, kapag nagbalita na kailangan nilang lumikas, di ba, pag may mga storm surge. So, yung mga tao, parang ayaw nilang sumunod dun sa sinasabi ng government na kailangan nilang lumisan or umalis muna pansamantala sa bahay nila kasi baka sila ay mapahamak. Lalo na kapag prone sa flooding or landslide. So, minsan nagkakaroon ng mistrust sa local government. Tapos, yung iba naman, they are lack of awareness about yung sa storm surge. And, natatakot din sila na iwan yung bahay nila kasi yung mga pangunahing kinabubuhay nila nandun. So, yun yung sa social vulnerability. Next, yung sa economic vulnerability naman, This kind of vulnerability may be associated with the financial status of a person to stay in a safer place and build a safer home. It could be drawn in that poor people are more vulnerable to the impact of disaster because of their incapacity to sustain a better place to stay, live, and build a family. Totoo naman, di ba, sobrang hirap ng buhay. Minsan, yung yung mahihirap na talaga. Minsan, they choose to stay along coastal areas, squatters, and bridges, yung mga nasa ilalim ng tulay. Diba? Which makes them more susceptible to disasters. Nakakatakot, diba? Lalo na yung sa Manila, yung minsan, pag nahulog yung sasakyan, so maraming maapektuhan na mga pamilyang nakatira sa ilalim ng tulay. If you watch some news regarding that issue. So also, countries which are not economically progressive are also more vulnerable to disaster. Paano? Because economic instability may result to low standard of infrastructures, emergency equipment, yung supplies, yung mga relief, which is very true, di ba? Na-experience natin ngayon yan. Lastly, the environmental vulnerability. So even our environment and natural resources, they are also vulnerable to disasters. Akala natin tayong mga tao lang, di ba? But also our environment. For instance, our forests are vulnerable to wildfires brought by some human negligence or by lightning. Mountains may also erode due to heavy rains, and the depth of our ocean may be affected by sight or sage. What is risk? So risk is used interchangeably with hazard. However, in the field of disaster management, risk is different from hazard because risk is the product of hazard and vulnerability. It is simplified by the given formula, which is hazard multiplied by vulnerability. It will result to risk. The equation means that risk is the product of the probability hazard and the degree of vulnerability. So the increase of either of the two factors will risk as the product. Thus, as the probability of hazard increases, so pag tumaas yung hazard, so yung risk din ay tataas. And further, as the degree of vulnerability increases, so thus risk also increases. How to deal with risk. So there are several ways on how to deal with risk, and here are some instances. We have the risk identification, classification, acceptance, avoidance, reduction, and transfer. First, the risk identification. So at home, in the workplace, or in school, or everywhere we go, we should be able to determine possible risk factors like the branch of a tree, which may possibly fall, an open manhole along the street, electric wires, which may be possibly be a source of short circuit, and others. Next, the risk classification. So here, it must be identified as minor or major risks by classifying risks. We may be able to prioritize which of the risks shall be addressed first. Okay? Next, the risk acceptance. So acknowledge the presence of risk and start planning on how to deal with it. For example, a house built under the bridge is vulnerable to disaster. The owner of the house must accept this fact in order to come up with measures to reduce the risk. Some measures may include the transfer of house, or relocation or evacuation, even without warnings during a torrential rain, di ba? Yung pag sobrang yung ulan. Next, the fourth one, risk avoidance. So, prevent the development of risk into hazard. For example, when an area is already declared by concerned authorities to be vulnerable to risk, like earthquake or landslide, one must never build structures there anymore. This is simply avoidance. No, kailangan talagang i-avoid. The fifth one, the risk reduction. So lessen the hazard that may be posed by the presence of risk. For instance, yung mga illegal mining that must be strongly enforced in identified places to reduce the occurrence of sinkholes, landslides, and flash floods. And lastly, the risk transfer. This pertains to the assignment of burden to third party like insurance companies. For example, afraid that your investment, like buildings and houses, may be ruined by fire, you may apply the same for the fire insurance. So this is the most common type of non-life insurance in our country. Next. I will end our discussion for this lesson 2 by reading the verse from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, verse 6. Be strong and of a good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He it is that does go with you. He will not fail you, nor forsake you. Amen. So, that's all for this day. Have a nice day and God bless.